Welcome to the Contrary, a weekly discussion of issues from a variety of women's perspectives with host Bonnie Urbay.
Welcome, making headlines this week. The '96 election heats up with big wins for Bob Dole, yet Pat Buchanan and Steve Forbes vow fights to the finish. In our look behind the headlines, parental rights. Virginia Governor George Allen focused the national spotlight on a new conservative movement that's gaining momentum in nearly 30 states, the legislation of parents' rights. Behind the headlines, parental rights. A study out this week shows the traditional family is gaining ground. Divorce rates have fallen, the number of two-parent households with children has gone up, and the number of births to unmarried women has slowed substantially. But while the family may not be in danger of extinction, a conservative grassroots movement is asking legislators across the country to do more to strengthen traditional family values and, in particular, parents' rights.
Parents can be trusted to make choices for their children in education. Parents should have the right to know and be involved if their young daughter is undergoing the trauma of an abortion. And the fundamental role of parents ought to be recognized in our fundamental law through a Parents' Rights Amendment to the state constitution.
Earlier this year, Republican Governor George Allen of Virginia astounded both parties when he became the first governor to endorse the Parental Rights Amendment. The controversial bill affirms that, quote, the rights of parents to direct the upbringing and education of their children shall not be infringed, end quote. It calls for the direct transfer of authority for school curricula from public school officials to parents.
We get calls here at Of the People every day from parents across the country who have any number of stories to tell about how they were surprised at how, say, the public school bureaucracy began usurping their rights to monitor their children's upbringing and education. So what we want to do is make sure that the schools and other government institutions do not actively undermine the kinds of values that parents are trying to teach their children at home.
So, parental rights supporters are pushing for a federal constitutional amendment and state-sponsored legislation to give parents greater legal standing in the public schools. The bill has been introduced in 29 states, including Colorado, where proponents say it could get on the ballot in November. While support for the amendment is growing, so is the opposition. Critics charge the parental rights legislation is a misguided attempt to advocate for rights that parents already have.
I think parents have a lot of rights. Clearly the courts have made it clear over time that parents have a lot of rights when it comes to schools. And in fact, one of the things that struck me recently was how much less authority schools have today than they had when I was growing up. And in fact, that may be one of the difficulties we're facing is not necessarily that schools have taken on more authority for children, but in fact, we have less authority.
Parental rights amendment supporters want less bureaucratic authority and more control of certain moral values in the public schools.
The Parental Rights Amendment is strongly supported by many of the folks usually characterized as the religious right, or choose your term. We welcome their support. But I think that the movement is beginning to be much more broad-based.
But that broad base of support has many educators concerned about the damage it could do to public schools and to the 45 million children who attend across the country.
The fear of what life would be like in public schools if this thing passed would be twofold. One is that I think you'd have a lot of chaos in terms of either schools not knowing what they could or couldn't do and being sort of very unclear as to what they could put into the curriculum and do, and then I think what would grow out of that chaos is a watering down and sort of making it a very bland program for fear that if you did anything out of the ordinary, somebody was going to come in and object and pull their children out.
I think that if the schools stuck to more of the basics, I think that a lot of the energy and the need for the Parental Rights Amendment might go away. As it is, until parents have a better vehicle to demand accountability from the public schools, I think you will see the movement for the Parental Rights Amendment continue.
Delegate Norton, are parents' rights under siege?
It is astonishing to think of conservatives trying to constitutionalize the relationship between the parent and the child. If this amendment, if anything, is redundant, who have all the rights, frankly, in this relationship of parents, it is almost impossible, for example, to release children from even abusive parents who are drug addicts and put them up for adoption early on, and so finally they're not adoptable at all. This is the most intimate of relationships. It is another way for the Christian right to go with their traditional agenda, which is creationism, along with evolution in the schools, to get at sex education. Look, this is a fight that's localized. It should be kept localized. There shouldn't be one constitutional rule for it, and if we did have that, we'd have all kinds of new litigation pitting one group of parents against another group of parents.
Josette?
Eleanor's right. The battleground has been the public schools. And in fact, in the states where there's a strong movement for this, it's been triggered by specific cases. For example, in Falmouth, Massachusetts, where the parents are going to the Supreme Court to fight for the right to opt their children out of condom classes, where their children as young as 11 years old are taught how to use condoms. The school has said they do not have that right. Some states, like New York, have allowed parents to jump out of those classes and to opt out for their children.
Some or most? Isn't it true most schools, if the parents object, will allow the kids out?
It's really state by state, county by county. But in Georgia, for example, the strongest supporters are two parents whose 14 and 15-year-old girls came home with a bag of condoms, prescriptions for birth control pills, a Pap smear test, and an AIDS test, and the parents weren't allowed to get access to what those tests showed. And now they're going to court. So it is a backlash, and it may be bad law to correct bad circumstances, but just like we see in the immigration backlash, unless someone addresses these concerns on the part of parents, I think we're going to see the movement grow.
I think this traditional tension between parents and state has been going on a long time, but right now the laws are weighted towards the parents. In fact, unless a parent does something egregious and the child proves by his or her physical presence that something bad is going on, the state, in the form of government agencies or public schools, can't intervene. And what's appalling about these amendments is that it presumes that, number one, government's an enemy, two, that you can legislate good parenting, and three, that somehow all parents are good parents. They're not. I mean, I'm still trying to learn, as I'm sure you're trying to learn each time. And so what this bill will do is open up doors that may have unfortunate circumstances and consequences that people didn't envision when they first proposed it.
There's nothing wrong with empowering parents to be able to have the right to tell a school board, hey, I don't want my kids to get condoms every day, and I don't want my children to know about contraceptives or abortions. I can teach that at home. I mean, they've been doing it for hundreds and hundreds of years. I do agree that there always needs to be a net, and I think with any amendment or any legislation, you're always going to have exceptions to the rule. So this argument that more children are going to be abused and we're not going to get these cases and the laws are going to keep us from getting kids away from parents, I don't believe that's possible.
Well, what kind of parents, aside from some of the rights that you two have mentioned, i.e. being able to opt out of classes to which they object, what kind of other rights do parents need that they don't have now?
Medical treatment is one of the big issues. We know that in some religions like Christian Science, they want the option to not use medical treatment, and that's part of the issue here. Also, it's getting access to tests, both psychological testing and physical testing in schools. It's a problem in a number of states.
All of these things can be done by legislation, and all of them can even be done at the local school level. You know what this country needs? It doesn't need a battle about parental rights. It needs the religious right, and it needs liberals, and it needs most organizations talking about parental responsibility. They're changing the subject. We've got parents in this country increasingly that even when they are middle class, work too much, give too little attention to their own kids. Now we're looking for the law to straighten out what parents have traditionally done themselves, frankly, in local school board meetings.
But I think part of it is that the elite in Washington is separate from some concerns that are going on there. You've seen the stories over the past decade. There is a real concern that the public schools, the parents have lost control, and they do feel that their children are coming out of there not better citizens, but often with worse problems than they went to.
What's happening right now is that because indeed more parents are working, you have dual earner couples by necessity, not because they just want to prove themselves, women in general. What you have are school systems that are now being charged to be babysitters, to teach, to prevent drugs from coming into the homes, to teach them about contraception, to prevent all kinds of things.
Why are they doing it? The parents are saying no. They don't want it.
No, they're pushing it onto the schools because the parents don't have time nor the willingness or interest sometimes to do that.
But the parents that do want to raise their own children
let me throw something out here. I find it more than a little ironic, I have to say, that the conservatives, who usually push for less government intervention, want, because this bill has been introduced in Congress as well, want basically, if they could get their druthers, a federal constitutional amendment legislating parental rights. By the same token, I hear Eleanor saying, let's do this this is a local issue, let's do it on a state-by-state basis, which is sort of the opposite view of the pro-choice movement.
And let me tell
What's
you why.
going on here?
What's going on here is that the religious right is frankly looking for a vehicle to build their movement. It's very hard to believe that they're serious. If so, they need counsel, constitutional counsel, to tell them that if you really want trouble with parental rights, let two groups of parents be at odds under an amendment on what parental rights are. There will be winners and there will be losers. The last thing you want is the courts in this kind of area. Indeed, in abortion, we're being entirely consistent. We said the court shouldn't be there. There should be between a woman and her doctor. And what happens between parents and the school should be between the parents and the school board.
I just have to say that it really annoys me that it seems that every time something like this comes along, we say, oh, look at the religious right. Oh, look at those wacky, conservatives. And it's not just the religious right or this extremist right people that want this. This is a regular American family.
Of the people, how can you say that though? The two main groups, I mean, even Greg Erkin in the field piece, who's the head of the people,
but if you
said that they are allied very closely with the Christian Coalition.
See the families that they're talking to in inner city schools, when they ask
where's
issues
the PTA
like this,
on this?
But let her wait. I want her.
When they, if you go and talk to a family in Baltimore, I mean, you're going to see that they want to be able to have some control in their child's life and want to be not, restricted by interference and be able to say to school boards. And I think that's one of the problems is that the school boards have too much power. I agree, they do have too much power. They don't need to be the parents. The parents need to be the parents, and the school boards just need to educate.
But you don't
and polls
need a
have shown that
constitutional amendment to do
58% of
that.
Democrats support wording of this kind in legislation, not in amendments, and in many states it is being pursued legislatively. In fact, in the U.S. Congress, it's a bill to just correct on the record to state that these rights should be protected.
One thing that's interesting is that this debate is taking place while, as we saw this week, a study comes out showing that the intact family is actually on the increase, that unwed motherhood is slowing, all those statistics that we mentioned earlier in the program. Any irony here?
It's not irony. A large cohort, the baby boomers, who make up a big chunk of the population, about a third, is aging, and they're into parenting, and they're into stabilizing their lives. And so it doesn't surprise me at all that we now have 700,000 more dual-headed families than, say, in the 80s. It's not so much, it's also not ironic to see that there's a lessening in the divorce rate as a consequence of that stabilizing of the dual-headed couple. I think the wording in the amendment, Josette, nobody will fight with. It's what it means and what it opens doors to that we are discussing here.
And if you want to do it with a piece of legislation, because states will differ on this matter, or do it with a resolution in your school board. Don't mess with the Constitution of the United States.
All right, and we will keep you posted out there to see if any of these any of this legislation is passed by any of the states that are considering it.